So the first biomedical condition that we're going to talk about today is intellectual disability. Keep in mind that there are a very wide range, there's a huge number of potential biomedical conditions that could be associated with a language disorder. We're only going to talk about a few of the more common ones today. Just know that these aren't the only things that could be associated with language impairment. So what is ID? We use the Psychological and Psychiatric Diagnostic Handbook, the DSM-5, to diagnose ID. And not we, I just mean we in general. It would typically be a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a team who would diagnose this condition. The requirements are substantial limitations in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior, and this has to occur before the child turns 18, so sometime in childhood. And for many, many kids, this is something that they are dealing with from the time that they're born. We know that 2.5% of the population in the US has ID, so it's a fairly substantial number actually. And there's a huge range in severity. Some people have very mild ID, some people are very profoundly affected. And we know that now when we're talking about severity, it's not so much just about IQ score, it's also about how the person is doing in their daily life. How much help do they need to be able to kind of carry out all their activities of daily living? Can have many causes, can be biological, can be socio-environmental, just depends on the person. And there are many other comorbidities that are associated with this. So people who have ID have, for example, a higher chance of also having a mental health condition, those sorts of things. So just a little bit about ID in general. We know that some of these people have trouble relying on organizational strategies that link words and concepts. So it's hard for them to kind of piece things together the way that other people can do. We know that when they're learning new things, they don't really spontaneously rehearse that information. And because they don't rehearse it, then they have a really hard time retrieving it later on. It's never really solidified in their memory. Their memory is really, it can be poor or slow, and that's the same thing that you see when they're trying to retrieve information from their brain. It's a slower process than it is for most people. And we find too that they may have more trouble with auditory input, so understanding things that are said to them, for example, compared to visual input, so understanding like pictures and signs. As far as what we know about how this progresses through life, early identification and intervention is really important. And the earlier that they are identified, the better chance they have to kind of build their skills in a more significant way. So your textbook says that some kids are not identified as having ID until age 2 or 3. I would argue that it's often not identified till even later. I have students who are in grade school who are just being identified with ID at that point. It was never caught earlier. So just something for you to know. Where these kids will go to school kind of depends on how much help they need and on what their school system or their school can offer them. So they might be in a separate classroom, they might be in a separate program, or they may be integrated into the typical classroom just with the supports that they need in that context. So it just depends. We do know that this doesn't go away. If you have ID, you have it for life. And so that transition to adulthood is really important because there are a lot of issues with, for example, living independently and trying to find a job and potentially having their own families. There are a lot of complexities involved in adulthood for people with ID. And the thing to know about ID is that it's really, really variable. Every person with ID has different needs. There's really no sort of one size fits all. As far as what their language is like, this partly depends on the condition that's causing their ID, if there is something causing it. So if they have, for example, some genetic syndrome that is causing that intellectual disability, then they may have certain characteristics associated that are more commonly seen with that particular syndrome. But even with mild cognitive impairment, we see that their language is often quite impacted and quite disordered. In general, these people tend to use, when they're kids, they tend to use shorter and less mature forms of language. So they speak in shorter sentences, they use fewer complex sentences, they make more grammatical errors, they know fewer words, both to use and to understand. They might have some phonological or speech sound difficulties or differences depending on their condition. For example, people with Down syndrome, because so many of their mouth structures are affected by Down syndrome, they often will sound a little bit different than other people do. And they also may struggle socially because they seem young for their age. And problem solving is really hard for them. Think about if you're having trouble with language, think about how you would talk yourself through a problem in your brain. If you have a problem with a friend, you can think through it before you try to address it. Well, that process of thinking through it requires language, and it requires a fairly efficient use of language also. So if you can't do that, chances that you're going to be able to solve that problem verbally are low. We also know, remember we said that their language is often quite impacted. It may seem that their language is very severely delayed, even if they only have a mild cognitive impairment. So their cognitive skills might be just kind of borderline, but their language can be quite severe. So what can we do to help these people? In general, it really depends on the individual person, but there are some things that sort of universally help. So slowing down is really, really important. Giving extra time to talk, so you taking extra time to talk and then giving an extra pause while they think of what they want to say, and don't rush them, don't cut them off, just give them that open space to talk. If you're sharing something important, break it up into short chunks. That will be easier for them to understand. If you're sharing something really, really essential for them, for example, you're going to maybe pick them up at the mall and you are working on a plan for that to happen, you want to make sure you use really short, concrete, simple language instead of being really wordy. So, you know, I'll pick you up here at this door at 5 o'clock. And then you want to complete a comprehension check to make sure that they understood. Where am I going to pick you up? Here. What time am I going to pick you up? 5. Okay. If you are using more complex language, you really have to explain it, and you want to connect it to what they already know whenever you can. Use that as a base to gain more knowledge. Visual supports can really help with comprehension. So in a classroom, you'd want to make sure that you're showing videos and pictures. For people who have very severe ID, they may need visual supports even just to complete basic tasks. So here are all the steps for brushing your teeth. Here are all the steps for doing the dishes. Here are all the steps for getting dressed in the morning, those kinds of things. If you're teaching them something new, you really want to model that task all the way through. So show them exactly how that task needs to be done and break it into small, simple steps and use those picture supports if needed, for sure. Repetition is really, really important for this population. So it will take, you can expect that it will take more exposures for them to learn new language than it would for other people. So for example, if you think that with another child, you might repeat a word 20 times before they'd know it. For people with ID, it might take 100 times before they know it. So repetition is really key. And hands-on activities are always helpful for learning. So thinking about any opportunity you can create for them to actually do something instead of just sit and passively listen is helpful. One thing I really want to point out is that it's tempting for us to, I think, talk to people with ID like they're younger because they kind of seem like they're younger. But as they get older, that becomes less and less appropriate. So it's really important to consider when they're in school age compared to preschool, and especially as they go on to be teenagers. We want to really make sure that we're not ever infantilizing them, because we can do all of these things and use all of these strategies without treating them like they're kind of a baby, even if they seem younger to us. So here are some examples of ID in popular culture. If you're not familiar with these, you could just take a quick look and see what they're about. If you've seen some of these, I want you to think about how people with ID are portrayed in them. And so Tom Hanks in Forrest Gump, that would be one of the older movies. This is a newer movie, Peanut Butter Falcon. And I thought it was interesting to consider how the portrayal of people with ID has changed over time. And it's still not perfect, but it's definitely a heck of a lot better than it used to be in most cases. So Peanut Butter Falcon actually got quite a bit of praise from the disability community because the actor who plays that character actually has a very similar profile of strengths and challenges in real life as the character does. So that was quite huge compared to, you know, Tom Hanks playing Forrest Gump, where his intellectual issues are really sort of fodder fodder for comedy more than anything else. So things are changing, which is good. We're going to talk about autism spectrum disorder because this is also very common. So you may have a language disorder that's associated with ASD. ASD is usually diagnosed by a multidisciplinary team. It wouldn't be the SLP themselves who make that diagnosis. However, an SLP is often the first point of contact for these kids because when a child has autism, it's not uncommon that one of the first things families notice is that that child's not really communicating the way that we'd expect. They're either not talking yet or they don't seem really interested in the people around them. So those parents approach the SLP and then usually the SLP says, I wonder if there's something more going on, and sends them for further assessment. So to be diagnosed with autism, you have to meet all of these three criteria. You have to have persistent trouble with social communication and interaction in different contexts, so not just in one place. You have to have trouble with that reciprocity in communication, with nonverbal communication and social interaction behaviors. And you have to have trouble developing and maintaining relationships that are appropriate for your maturity level. And then the third criteria that's really important for a diagnosis of autism is this idea of restricted repetitive behaviors. So this could look like stereotyped repetitive motor movements or use of objects or speech that's repetitive, excessive reliance on routines or ritualized patterns of behavior, resistance to change. It might look like being highly fixated or having really abnormally intense interests or focuses. And then the way that you react to environmental or sensory input is also an important component of this as well. So I will just remind you that since we've moved to this format for diagnosing autism, there is no longer any Asperger's label. You have to meet these three criteria to be diagnosed with autism. And a lot of people who would have formerly been diagnosed with Asperger's wouldn't actually fit into this diagnosis at all. Sometimes I have students or clients where I feel like they meet many of the criteria for autism, but because they don't have number 3, they have not received a diagnosis, even though they certainly have 1 and 2. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So if you think of ASD in your mind, you might have sort of a stereotypical idea of what that could look like. And it certainly can include things like rocking, being really interested in lights and spinning objects, insistence on routines, really being rigid, being preoccupied with certain objects, not liking loud sounds. All of those things, even though they're part of that stereotyped kind of notion of autism, they do actually occur for a lot of kids, especially in the earlier years. So for example, I had a client who was in preschool, and with the truck that he liked to play with, he really liked to play with this one truck. Instead of playing with the truck the way most kids would, he just would spin the wheels and stare at the wheels spinning. And he would do that for hours. That's the only way he would play with that toy. But you need to keep in mind that not everyone displays these stereotypical characteristics. And in fact, there are people who aren't diagnosed with autism until later in life, maybe their teenage years or even adulthood, because they haven't necessarily shown all these kind of classic sort of red flags. We don't really know exactly what causes autism for sure yet, but we know that it's definitely biological. And for some people with autism, they do have a genetic mutation that led to the autism. So it wasn't inherited, it was just kind of a freak thing. I just want to be really, really clear about the fact that vaccines do not cause autism. That is widely disproven. So that myth is busted if it wasn't busted already. If you have any questions about that, feel free to follow up with me directly. Autism can be quite common. 1 in 88 kids have it. It's higher if there's a family history of autism, so a parent or sibling who has autism. Boys get it a lot more often than girls. And I think a lot of people assume that people with autism have a low IQ. That's actually widely untrue. Only 25% actually meet the criteria for also having ID. Most kids actually have an IQ that's 70 or higher, so in a range that would allow them to kind of function and learn. It's just the autism which makes that process a little bit harder. We know that autism is really all about having trouble processing incoming information. So the information that's coming in isn't analyzed the same way that a neurotypical person would analyze that information. Eye and face processing can be really hard, and there's some thinking that maybe that's part of why these kids have trouble bonding with their caregivers. They can't kind of process the face in the same way that neurotypical kids do. We also know that they tend to process as like a big picture chunk, and they don't really analyze the little pieces of that. So they store all of the information that's coming in as a whole, and then they reproduce it later in identical fashion. So what that means is that some of those issues that you see with having trouble with change, having trouble with unexpected things that happen, they learn that things go a certain way, and that flexibility becomes very challenging. So we said often these kids are identified when they're younger, 2 to 3 years old, but we said that's not always the case. As far as how they go to school, it really depends, again, on the context. So they might be in the typical classroom, or they might be in a special education class. For example, Edmonton Public Schools runs an interactions program that is just for kids who have autism, and a wide variety of different severities of autism, but it's definitely catered to their needs. And there's a very wide variety of outcomes for adults. So some people with autism will go on to live sort of very, I'll use the word normal lives, as far as the fact that they can live independently, they have families, they hold meaningful employment, they can do very well in school if they find something that interests them. Whereas for people who are on the more severe end of the spectrum, they may end up living in supported living facilities, not being able to find meaningful employment. So just know that the range is huge. So as far as what language is like, remember this is a spectrum. So there are always going to be people who are on the less severe end and people who are on the more severe end. We know that for ASD, communication problems are a major indicator that something's going on, and this is often one of the biggest red flags. You may be wondering how many people with ASD actually do learn to speak. And it's definitely not all of them. So the estimate, and this is a very wide range again, is that 25 to 60% of people with ASD remain nonverbal. And so for these people, some kind of assistive or augmentative communication system becomes really, really important, because that's going to be their only way to really interact with the rest of the world. You may see echolalia, which is where they repeat things that they've heard just exactly the same way, and they may even use entire verbal routines. So for example, I had a client who watched a lot of movies, and the child couldn't really talk to you about anything that's going on in their life, but they would be able to recite like half of a movie verbatim. And again, that's just sort of an example of how they're processing. They take that whole and learn that, but then can't manipulate anything else within that. So that's definitely something that's fairly common. Often their prosody is affected if they do talk, and they can sound a little bit halting or mechanical, or they maybe don't use the same intonation as neurotypical people would. They often have more trouble with pragmatics and semantics, especially pragmatics, and this causes them to be kind of perceived as odd sometimes, even if they are higher functioning. They tend to have difficulty really connecting with the people around them. It's hard for them to repair a communication breakdown. It's hard for them to engage, especially on another person's topic of interest. So know that in people who do talk, these areas tend to be more affected than form. And semantics is another good example. So you may have a client with ASD who talks, who has very good vocabulary for their areas of high interest. For example, I have a client right now who could tell you his vocabulary for trains and airplanes is outstanding, but his vocabulary for some things that we might perceive as more basic, like even things you'd find at the grocery store, is really not as strong as you would expect. Even for people with ASD, if they have relatively good language, the subtlety of language is often hard for them. So it's really hard for them to pick up on jokes or sarcasm or irony. That higher level and figurative language is often interpreted literally. So I said to a student in a classroom who's very, very verbal, I said, I'm just gonna steal you for a minute, because I wanted the student to come with me into the hallway. And she just looked at me and she said, well, how are you going to do that? Because she thought I actually meant stealing, not just taking her with me. They also have trouble reading nonverbal cues, which really can affect their peer interactions. It's hard for them to tell when a peer doesn't want to play, or when a peer is done with the conversation, or when a peer is upset. And on the flip side, it can also be hard for them to tell when a peer wants to play with them or wants to talk to them. That can make things really hard. All of these things can also affect reading comprehension and writing for older students. So if you're reading a novel, you need to be able to pick up on things like jokes and sarcasm and irony in order to get the full idea of what happened. So just like people with ID, strategies for supporting language in people with ASD vary very widely. So I've kind of broken it up into two lists. One side for people who are nonverbal or minimally verbal, and then one side for people who are more verbal. With people who are not verbal, we said assistive tech is really huge. And what we know is that we really need to be advocates for the use of that technology. And then we actually need to use it consistently when we're interacting with them, not just when we feel like it, not just when it's convenient. We need to make a commitment to using it all the time. You will learn more about AAC later in the term. We know that engagement is really important because that's something that is harder for them to develop. So that might be something we'd focus on. To support comprehension, we want to use those short, simple sentences again. Predictable routines are really important, and we can layer language into those routines. Really utilize those existing interests and motivators, and then repeat, repeat, repeat in order to build some new language. We want to make sure that we're honoring all nonverbal attempts to communicate. They can't communicate verbally, so we have to take the nonverbal, and that's really important to show them that that matters and they matter. And visual schedules can also be really helpful. So, for example, a child who is having trouble functioning in the classroom because they don't understand what's going to happen will do usually better with a list of pictures on the wall or on his desk showing every single thing that's going to happen in the day, and knowing that ahead of time is really important. If the child is verbal, you want to pay attention to explaining that abstract or non-literal language, impacts on reading and writing. They really need explicit teaching of conversation and social skills. They need to learn more about how to actually have a conversation. How do I ask a question in conversation? How do I make a comment in conversation? How do I turn the conversation back to my partner? Supporting peer interactions, whether that's play or social conversation. Sometimes they need help with perspective taking, so they can get very focused on their perspective, and it's hard for them to realize that other people have other ideas about things that aren't the same as them. And problem solving too. You will see some social skills programs that are designed for people who have autism, and there's really good evidence for these programs. Actually, they do seem to really help. If these people do have really specific areas of strength and interest, use those, because that might be something that they can continue to carry on in the future if there is something that they're really good at. Sometimes I think we want to force them to kind of like diversify or branch out, and there is definitely a role for that. But it's okay to allow them to continue to explore the things that they're really interested in. Generalization of skills is really, really important. So if you've been working something in one context, you need to work on it in a wide variety of contexts as well, so that they'll do it in more places than just with you. Because remember that learning can be very rigid, and so you need to teach it across all places. And then we really need to continue to be advocates for them, because sometimes by the time they're, older elementary students or teenagers, these kids can seem fairly, they can seem like they're doing a lot better than they were before, because they are doing a lot better than they were before. But the thing is that because their challenges are a little bit more subtle, it's really important that they continue to get support, because otherwise they'll fall behind again in the future. So even if it seems like they're doing pretty well, continued supports are important. The other thing that's important to think about with kids with autism is that the whole team, the family, and the client should be involved in what this support system looks like. And you can also consider training peers in the classroom to help with some of these things as well. It's good for kids to kind of know a little bit about autism and what that means. And actually that takes me to this exercise that I've posted for you. This isn't required, but it's definitely something I'd encourage you to do because it's quite fun. So Julia is a Sesame Street character who they introduced a few years ago who does have autism. And I posted the video clip for you on eClass where they introduce her. And I want you to think about how that introduction goes. How does Sesame Street portray this child? What does Big Bird, who's in this video a lot, what does Big Bird think about Julia, and how does that change? And then I also want you to look for how Alan, who's this man, how do Alan and Julia's peers also use principles of inclusion so that she can participate throughout the day, and pay attention to the language that Alan and the other kids use when they're talking about Julia. It's really quite neat. There are some other common examples of people with ASD in the media. So there are some things you may be familiar with. Abed in Communities, one good example. And Hannah Gadsby, if you're familiar with Hannah from Netflix has also been diagnosed with autism and is quite open about it. And these are two Pixar short films. One was inspired by a parent who has a child with autism, Float, and then Loop is about a girl who has actually, I think, nonverbal autism. So definitely some things to check out if you're interested. Okay, we'll talk about brain injury in the next one.